Hi, this is your buddy Quinn, and I'm here with the introduction to Bicycle Thieves. Bicycle Thieves is a 1948 film coming out of Italy, and it is also known as the Bicycle Thief in the United States. So, depending on where you find it, it may be called the Bicycle Thief or Bicycle Thieves. Bicycle Thieves is the more literal translation of the Italian ladri di bicicletta. To understand the importance of this film, and this is one of the most influential films in the history of cinema, we need to talk a little bit about World War II and what brings us to 1948 in Italy that makes this film different than really much of what had come before, including many of the films in this series. If we look at the years of World War II in Europe in particular, World War II was not a great time for film. It was actually a very productive time for film. It was also a very productive time for cinema goers. Many people went to the cinema at greater rates than before the war, in part because they were getting information about how their country was doing in the war in the theater, because most people did not have televisions at the time. But it wasn't a great period for cinema in other ways. One of those reasons was that individual governments took control over their film industries. The United States was very interventionist in Hollywood as well. And film was harnessed not only for entertainment, and people were really craving entertainment to take their mind off the war, but it was also harnessed really for propaganda purposes and to mobilize citizens around the cause of the war. As a result, film industries were really highly censored during this period. The opening space before you actually started the feature film, which we now use for previews primarily, was usually used for newsreels. It would be discussion of the latest developments in the war. It was often done in ways that would uplift and inspire, interviews with soldiers who were courageous in serving their country. But much of what people experienced in the cinema was obscuring some quite difficult truths about how the war was actually going. Some films that seemed to be primarily for the purpose of entertainment also had a secondary purpose, and that secondary purpose, beyond just normal propaganda, would be modeling what good citizens should do in the war. So a lot of people looked to film stars as role models, and governments were very interested in making sure that those role models were ones that served civic purposes. The mid-1940s was really a period of time toward the end of World War II when cinema attendance hit an all-time high. In the United Kingdom, for example, more than half of Britons went to see cinema regularly during this time. It became extremely important for them as a social event in the context of the war. A very famous wartime movie in Britain is Mrs. Miniver, which does a remarkable job of both serving as propaganda for the British government during a time of desperation in the war, but also somehow managing to find the fine line between art and social message. So that film is not part of this series, but it is a film that I would recommend that you see. In Germany, the film industry was very intrusively controlled by the Nazis, which did hire some fine artists in the film industry during the period, but that control really destroyed the soul of the artistry in German film in World War II. And the fascist government in Italy did the same. Themes during World War II were also very war-centric. So if you just look at the number of films produced worldwide during World War II, about 30% of all of those movies included wartime themes. This brings us to Italy. Italy was on the Axis side in World War II. Mussolini, who was a fascist politician ruling Italy, made an alliance with Hitler in Germany. And so when the Germans lose the war, and even before that, Italy is also going to lose the war. In the spring of 1945, Mussolini is actually executed, and Italy is released from the bonds of its German occupation. It takes a couple of years after Mussolini is executed for the Italian society and state to really find its feet. And so by 1947, a series of treaties are signed with Italy, and Italy is forced in the process of this to give up its colonial empire, which really negatively affects the economy. And it's also forced to pay quite high penalties and war reparation to the Allies, which also devastates it economically. Italian politics is transformed in this time. The Italian monarchy is abolished in a popular referendum in 1946, and Italy becomes a republic. And the economy is really devastated by the war. Partly because of the economic devastation, society is also now filled with infighting. There's also a lack of centralized leadership, which makes it quite difficult for society to find its footing. And that's the context that people are experiencing in Italy when this film is shot in Rome, 1948. This is usually considered to be a film that represents the core themes of Italian Neorealism. And Italian Neorealism is a movement in film history that doesn't last terribly long. It only lasts about 8 or 9 years. But it has enormous consequences for the development of film worldwide in the 50s and 60s. Some people might even argue that Icicle Thieves is the paradigmatic example of Italian neorealism. Early on in Italian cinema, Italian films always were a little bit different from other films in parts of Europe, in part because they were more stylistic. They were more artistic in their goals. They were a little bit less plot-driven and more style-driven. And after World War II, some of that influence comes back, but we get a number of new developments. And so Italian neorealism really starts about 1945 or so, as Italy is losing World War II. There are some key markers to Italian neorealism, which you'll see in this film. So one is thematically, Italian neorealism focuses on the poor and the working classes rather than on the rich and the glamorous. It's also notable because it doesn't use studios very much anyway. This film doesn't use studios at all. The directors in Italian neorealist school felt like filming on location was most important. And in addition to whatever cinematic qualities that provides, it's also a practical decision in this period because much of the big studio industry that was state-sponsored in Italy was actually damaged during the war, and so studios were not readily available. Neorealism uses non-professional actors. That's a new development. It tends to focus on mundane daily life activities, including the care of children. And in terms of purpose, it tends to raise questions about ethics, raise questions about morality, and ultimately what it means to be part of society and to be a human. So the first major film in Italian neorealism that made an international splash anyway was a film called Rome, Open City, which won the grand prize at the Cannes Film Festival in 1946. If we start Italian neorealism from about 1945, 1946, it ends in the early 1950s. So let's say it goes for about 7 or 8 years, in part because in the 1950s, the Italian economy really starts to grow. And it becomes the fastest growing economy in Europe for a period of time. So the focus on post-war conditions, the focus on poverty and economic issues becomes a little bit less relevant. This is a school that has strong influence on French New Wave cinema, which is a major movement in European film in the 1950s and 1960s. It also is disproportionately important to the development of Indian cinema. Much of early Indian cinema was derived from Italian neorealism. It strongly influenced the Iranian film industry as well in the 1960s, and even as far away as Japan. So one of the most famous studios in Japan, known as Studio Ghibli, which makes animated films, was also influenced by this school of filmmaking. One thing that I invite you to think about as you watch this film, in particular if you've been watching other films in the series in English or in German, is to think about the linguistic differences of Italian and how that affects the overall filmmaking. So Italian is a very bouncy language. It makes this film sound, I think, quite different from other films that we've watched. The way that language is used in Italy is also somewhat culturally different. So pay attention to that and try to understand a little bit about why this film sounds different, in part because of its language and its linguistic cultural context. Now, on to the film specifically. So this film was directed by a famous filmmaker. He wasn't terribly famous at this point, although he'd done an important film prior to Icicle Thieves. His name is Vittorio De Sica. He was actually born in poverty in the very first part of the century, of the 20th century. He started to make it as a stage actor and then turned to directing. He would act sometimes as well, but he developed a partnership with a very influential screenwriter named Cesare Zavattini. Cesare Zavattini really helped define many of the neorealist themes of Italian cinema. He didn't have studio backing for this film. Some people were almost ready to buy it, but because he didn't have financial backing, he essentially funded this film with contributions from friends. Like many of the films in our series, this film was not terribly well received at home, in part because it was criticized for the director's portrayal of Italians to the outside world. It felt like Italians didn't come across as noble as many Italians thought they should for an international audience. So this film is special for a few reasons. I think the most important one is probably the actors. There are three principal actors, two actors and an actress, that you'll get a lot of in this film. The core of the film is a father-son relationship. And this is the relationship between the father, Antonio, and the son, Bruno. Lamberto Maggiorani plays Antonio. And Antonio actually showed up. There was a casting call to see if anybody wanted to be in this film. He showed up, but not for himself. He actually brought his son to audition. But De Sica saw him, found him to be a really intriguing face and walk. And so he casts Maggiorani to play Antonio. Maggiorani was a factory worker. He was not a professional actor. He was only paid the equivalent of about $1,000 for the film, which he used to buy some furniture and take his family on a small vacation. And people knew in the factory that he went out and starred in this film. And so when he came back to work, people thought that he was now a fancy actor and the factory was struggling, and so he was actually laid off. He didn't get a job back at that factory. He tried some work as a bricklayer. He tried to take his success in this film to try to get acting parts in other movies, but he never had another major part and struggled a little bit economically after this film. The young boy, Bruno, is played by Enzo Staiola, who was 8 when he was cast, 9 years old during the filming. And he actually was cast after the film had actually started filming. So he was in Rome. He was selling flowers with his father. He got distracted. He wanted to see some of the early scenes in the film. The director liked the way he looked. They liked the way he walked, and hired young Enzo to play the role of Bruno after the film had already got underway. And Enzo does do some work after this as a child actor, but only until about 15 years old. After that, he gives up acting and becomes a mathematics teacher, and he's actually still alive. The final major role is the character of Maria. This is Antonio's wife and Bruno's mother. She is played by Leonela Carrel, and she was not an actress either. So she was a journalist hoping to get an interview with the director. He gave her the interview and then thought maybe she would be a good lead in this. So she's hired out of her journalistic job and ends up doing some acting for about 10 years, but again, doesn't become a major actress. So the acting is very interesting. It's partly interesting because it's not professional, because of the backstories of how these actors and actresses were hired, and the remarkable job that they do, regardless of their previous background. A couple of other things that I think are special personally about this film. The settings I think are really interesting, in part because nothing is shot in studio. The crowd scenes are quite real. Icicle did hire at one point 40 street vendors, right, for one scene. So he would sometimes hire people out of the crowd. There's one scene you'll probably notice later in the film where Bruno is almost run over by a car. That was not staged at all. They were just filming on the street and cars didn't stop. I think there's also a lot to be said for the cinematography of this movie. It was quite meticulous. Often Icicle would use multiple cameras from many different angles on the actor so that he could choose which shot to use. There's some good close-ups. There's a lot of good emotion in this. Some of the things that we saw in Passion of Joan of Arc, I think, are replicated here, but in a much more realistic and context-driven setting. I particularly like the way that the camera trains on the bicycle as the key object of desire in this movie. The bicycle becomes, I think, an iconic center point for the camera. It often will focus on the bicycle, and for the viewer, when you see the bicycle and you also recognize the title of the film, it tends to generate some suspense as to what's going to happen to the bicycle. When and how will it be stolen? Who is the thief, for example? I also think at a deeper level, the bicycle in this movie serves as a symbol of what helps one person stay ahead of another person in more ways than one. A future Italian film director that becomes extremely well known, perhaps one of the most famous of them all, Sergio Leone, was an assistant on this film, and so he was very influenced by Icicle's choices. He's also used as an extra in the film as a priest. He directs films later on, like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which are considered to be some of the best films ever made. All right, so what should you watch for as you watch this film? This is a movie with some really powerful themes in it. One theme I think is central to the humanities is the theme of human dignity. So the importance of work, the terror of vulnerability, what changes inside of you when you're in poverty, when you feel desperate. What does it mean as well to feel shame or worth? Why do we feel self-worth? Why do we feel shame? Those are themes that are lovingly brought into this film. Another big theme is family relationships. So we talked about how day-to-day mundane life is important in this film movement. This core relationship between the father and son, I think, is at the center of the film. And it raises some questions. What do we owe to one another in our relationships? How do we help and protect one another from the hazards of life? You'll be tempted to watch this movie from the perspective of the father because he's really the center point of the movie. But the son, I think, plays at least as important of a role. And I suggest that you try to get your mind around seeing the events in this film from the young boy's point of view as well. What is the relationship between the father and the son? Is it loving? Is it tense? Why do they stick together? How does that relationship evolve over time? There's a lot of richness there. Another theme, I think, although it's not explicitly proposed as a religious theme in this film, is the theme of faith and its intersection with personal resilience. So how do we as a person cope with uncertainty, right? With a future that seems scary? How do you recover when things don't go your way? Under what conditions does it make sense to persist despite the odds? Under what conditions does it make more sense to give up, right? Those are addressed in the course of the film. In part because of the period in which it's shot, the viewers are going to recognize some of the social challenges that are depicted in the film, crime being one of those. Generally, after a very, very strong state under Mussolini, a very fascist ideology, we now have a lot of social and political uncertainty and an unraveling society where people are taking advantage of some of the chaos after World War II. And in that unraveling society, how do we collectively respect or disrespect another person's humanity? When should we trust others, right? When they might not trust us? Under what conditions can we reliably judge others? Or is it really too difficult to judge another person's actions because it's hard to have lived in their shoes? So there's a lot of richness to those themes, and I think we can have a great discussion about that. The ending is interesting, and I hope that you'll decide if you like it or don't like it. Some people like it, some people don't. It reflects the type of ending that was quite common in Charlie Chaplin's films. So it's a bit of a tribute to Chaplin. It is worthy of discussion. For those of you who really like this film and are interested in pursuing it further, there's actually a satire. It's an Italian comedy satire based on The Bicycle Thief. In English, the title is The Icicle Thief, and it was filmed in 1989 and is a commentary on contemporary consumerism, but borrows a lot from some of the themes of Bicycle Thieves. So have a great film.